and welcome everyone. As Jerry mentioned, this is the third installment of Doing More with Less, and we are exploring just how to manage that ever-increasing volume of information, both paper and digital, with fewer staff and resources. So this is the third of about 8 webinars that we've got planned that we're conducting over the course of the year, usually on the third Thursday of each month. Sometimes that has to be adjusted a little bit. So with that, let's get started. So this one is about retention schedules versus record series. And it's about really the terminology that we use when we're talking about those things and how that impacts our ability to effectively and efficiently manage records. So by the way, if you've ever tried to come up with an image for a PowerPoint on how to depict retention schedules and record series, it's not an easy task. Jerry and I came up with this one about the stones. We were kind of looking at scales and various things like that, but I think it actually works well because it's a way to talk about stacks of things, things that are not necessarily easily definable. And you might have a stack of many of them or a stack of few of them. And so it's kind of a good way just to think about things in generic terms. I might reference back to that later on as we talk about this. But just one of those difficult things when you're just trying to put together a good pictorial for talking about the topic. So if you've ever done that, you know where we're at in that space. So before we get into that discussion, let me introduce our guest panelist. I am very pleased to have Barb Benson with us today. I only know her as Barb. I know her official name there is Barbara Benson, but we've known each other for quite a long time, so I go with Barb. So just a little bit of background for Barb. She has, since about 1992, been the University Records Officer and Director of Records Management Services at the University of Washington. She received graduate degrees in history and archives and records management from New York University. So she's an East Coaster, but she's now on the West Coast. She's worked as an archivist or records manager in a lot of different industries, including not-for-profits, banking, city government, state government, and higher education. She's a frequent speaker at ARMA, Northwest Clerks Institute, and a lot of other organizations and institutions that are interested in managing data and information. So I've personally known Barb for about 20 years or more, I think, and have really just come to treasure her experience, her knowledge, and her insight in this field. So not to mention, she's just a lot of fun to talk to. So welcome, Barb. Glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you so much for the kind words.
Oh yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with Zasio, let me just take about 30 seconds to highlight who we are, what we do. So we get the name from Kevin Zasio, who started the business back in 1987, and we provide both software and consulting resources for retention scheduling and information management. And those software solutions are both on-prem and cloud-based. They deal with retention scheduling and information management, as I mentioned earlier. And our consulting team is becoming quite renowned in their field for their ability to do global retention scheduling, data mapping, policy development, training, you name it. They are an excellent resource for people to tap into. And along with that, a really crack legal research team, a team of attorneys and paralegals who do all of the kind of the behind the scenes work of gathering those citations and regulations that drive the retention scheduling process. So that sort of is the underpinnings of our business, but we are really just known by and driven by continuous innovation in the field, both in the software and the consulting areas. So that's a little bit about us. Of course, you can feel free to go to our website and learn more. We'll have some contact information here at the end of the webinar. So to introduce the topic, I want to just talk a little bit about semantics and signs, because that's really what this is about. And as you can see here, the definition comes from that ancient Greek word meaning significant, but it's really about the study of reference, meaning, or truth. And I think that's really appropriate for the topic that we're talking about today, because really words are how we convey meaning, but they can also create a lot of confusion if we don't have a common reference point. So just like signs pointing in the wrong direction, that can really steer us in different directions if we don't have that common point. So as we talk about abstract concepts like retention scheduling, each of us creates a mental picture of what that means. So when we say, retention schedule, we kind of create a picture of that. But if your mental picture is different than my picture, then it's just like signs pointing in different direction. It's like, your north being my south or something similar to that. And of course, there's several terms that we use to describe this general idea of keeping stuff for a period of time and then getting rid of it. You might call it retention schedules, record series, categories, buckets, maybe something completely different. I kind of threw a mashing of different words together in that pictorial there on the screen. So today we're going to sort out some of these terms, try to agree on some useful definitions, and maybe align those mental pictures at least to some degree so we know what it is that we're talking about. And you might be asking, well, what's this got to do with doing more with less? And I thought about that as well, but I do think it's germane to the topic, because if you don't have that common reference point, it just makes everything so much more difficult. So we're trying to smooth the whole process of talking about retention and scheduling and how you get rid of stuff. But also, we're going to be delving into a little bit of the granularity discussion, like different levels of granularity when you manage the retention schedule. So that can also impact how much work it takes to manage the retention schedule. And then finally, the amount of control that you give to other entities like departments to have something different than what you define as your retention schedule, that can also play into what it takes to manage the compliance of your overall information management program. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. And I'm going to start this with a poll just to make sure that everyone out there is engaged. And I'm going to open up the poll here so that you can be the first people to chime in on what it is exactly do you call the things that you want to retain. I've given you a few options there, so I'll give you just about a minute to fill in those questions, and we'll see where that kind of falls and see if we are aligned at all in this process. Yeah, it looks like we are coming in pretty strongly with a couple of terms here, so that's good. We may not be too far off. We've got the majority of people that have voted. I'll give it just a few more seconds here. This is just to make sure that everyone's paying attention, not answering emails while you're watching a webinar. All right, I think that's good. We'll go ahead and close that poll off, and I'll share with you those results. So here you can see that most of us are aligned on the fact that we call it a retention schedule. So that makes sense. I think that's a pretty common thing in the industry, but we do have some that call them record series, some that call them classifications. I've definitely seen that as well. But that's good. We're not too far off in our general understanding of what we call these. So that's good to see. All right. With that, let me go ahead and turn that part off. And Barb, we're going to first talk about kind of the evolution of retention tracking. And so, when I started more than 20 years ago in this business, it was really common to see records, I will call them schedules for now until we define that term, but retention schedules with, often more than 1,000, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 things. I won't, go into what we're going to call those things just yet. Maybe we call them stones, record titles, categories, whatever you want to call them. But it had a lot of stuff on it. It was a pretty granular, pretty detailed list of items. So it wasn't uncommon to see 2,000 or 3,000 of those. Maybe they were department specific in many cases, where each department had their own retention period for a common record type. But that's really changed over time that I've seen. We've got more functional schedules, big bucket approaches. So I'm kind of curious, have you seen the same thing? And maybe you can describe how you've seen that evolve as well.
Sure. I mean, it is really interesting. I mean, I started in records management more years ago than I care to admit. And man, I remember getting one of the early desktop computers when I was working in the private sector, and it was a word processor really, but everything was in paper. And so you had some organizations that were centralized. So they had these, picture 1956 central file rooms, but a lot of other types of organizations, especially government or universities, very, very decentralized. Every office had their own paper records in their office. And people call things by different names that resonate with them. We call it local now, but one word for it is vernacular. It's what the vernacular is. And the best example, I was telling you about this, that I could give for this sort of situation is when I worked corporate, we would call the documentation for procurement, we would call it a purchase request. And then
Sure.
when I started working with local governments, they didn't call them purchase requests, they called them vouchers. And so back in the day, you would have this one-to-one match for what I would call a record series, and it would be based on what the individual office called those records so that they could more easily understand what we were talking about and hopefully at that point more easily implement the retention schedule. But as we've moved away from paper into more digital environments, and digital environments by their nature, in some cases we still have very decentralized, but you do have some more centralized environments. And we start going into a situation, I think, where we're going, instead of from one to one, we're going one to many.
Mm.
And so you have one, I would call it a record series for many types of records that maybe have the same function. And the example I would use for that, we have had an interesting journey here at the University of Washington. And you guys can look it up, I won't go into detail, but we're huge, we're bloody huge, we're bigger than a city. We have our own power plant, for heaven's sakes, we have our own police department. I mean, we're absolutely huge. And we, different departments within the university provide goods and services to other departments within the university. And we have our documentation for that that would go on a retention schedule. And we discovered when we looked into this that there were 97, literally 97 different record series that we had over about 30 different departments who were billing other departments for goods and services.
Wow.
And when we left paper and started going more digital, we decided to create, there are many, many words for it. We came up with our vernacular, which was a super series. Some people would call it a functional series. Some people would call it a bucket series, but we came up with one record series that we call billing source documents. And we discontinued the 97 individual ones, and we have now one to many. So one series that goes to many different types of records. They all have the same function, but they had different names in the past.
Yeah, so you had to move
So
away from that idea of saying, well, here's a document, a piece of paper, a form, a file, whatever it is, and we're going to label that, we're going to name it. You had to say, well, we've got too many things that are in that category. Let's kind of step back a little bit and call it.
streamline it.
Yeah.
So this was, so when you talk about doing more with less, instead of having to manage and update as necessary 97 different record series, we only have to update one now.
Yeah,
And so
beautiful.
that made a huge difference for us in terms of efficiency.
Did the different departments though have trouble understanding that this one broad category applied to all those different types of
Of
things?
course they did.
Yeah.
And of course they were very resistant. But maybe it's the East Coaster in me coming out, even though I've been on the West Coast for a good 30 years now. But the short answer to the question was, hey, the world changes and you have to change with it.
Yeah.
And you have to be flexible and you have to accept change, because change is the only way that things can improve. And the status quo was no longer working. We had, as you talk about it, across the university, across our 3 campuses, when we started the process of aggregating, we had, roughly speaking, 3,000, 3,500 different record series. And so we've definitely experienced the same
Yeah.
trend.
I did see one schedule that had 98,000 series on it, but that was kind of a one-off. Yeah. A
That's
lot
a
of
good,
duplication. We won't go there. That's another topic altogether.
that's extreme.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you evolved that, did you have to teach a different vernacular, as you called it? Did you have to kind of retrain what people called these things, these buckets?
Exactly. We did, obviously, we did a lot of training. We did a lot of communication. Um, and the way we have chosen, and I think this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit in the conversation, but the way we have chosen to display this record series on a retention schedule has evolved over time. You know, we start out with saying, okay, these are billing source documents. So we have a title, and then for our schedules, we always have a description within each record series. So we all know that we're talking about the same thing.
Right.
But we discovered in doing the description, we started out with brief descriptions, 1 or 2 sentences.
Hmm.
And we found that with some types of records, people would read the description, they'd say, oh, okay, this is a very simple concept, I get it. But with others where we were aggregating things more by function, and it wasn't as um, clear to people that these different types of records share the same function,
Hmm.
we found we had to be more detailed in how we were representing the series on a schedule.
Because maybe a person wouldn't see their specific document in that
Exactly.
description, so they said, well, maybe that doesn't apply.
Exactly. And then you sit there and say, I'm not going to list out every type of document that you could find in this record series, but sometimes it's swimming upstream and you decide, you know, I'm just tired and maybe I will, or maybe I'll just list the most common of them. And
Hmm.
so I think that, you know, when you look at the whole retention scheduling and when you look at what your retention schedule can look like and what your record series look like. And again, this is probably jumping forward again, over time, as we've watched our records management industry grow and we've watched our professional organizations grow, new concepts in how to display this information like functional retention schedules or functional record, you know, functional, well, let's call it retention schedules for a minute, and functional and bucket retention schedules have come across as concepts. And I have to admit, and maybe this is not a good thing for this particular session, but I've always played a little bit fast and loose with it. And I've thought of those things, those concepts of being part of a toolkit that I could take advantage of. And I don't have to play it close to the line. I don't have to say, I'm only doing a functional retention schedule. I could say, yeah, I'm going to do a functional retention schedule, but this record series within this retention schedule, I'm going to use a bucket concept for this
Yes.
single record series because it displays the content better so that my customers, my people at the university will understand the information I'm trying to give them better.
That makes perfect sense. In fact, I thought of a term as we're going through this, what I call language bemuddlement. So kind of befuddled and muddlement mixed together, because as we use terms, sometimes I find like if I'm talking with a customer or prospect, I sort of fish for what term resonates. You know, because I might be
Exactly.
calling it a schedule, they might be calling it a series. And so if I sense that there's a misunderstanding, I'll kind of fish for different terms and see, you know, if we can come to a common understanding. But it does end up, like you said, you end up kind of playing loose with the language, and that just ends up, you know, confusing things, but it also just helps to kind of get along with, okay, you know, let's just try to make this work as we go along.
Exactly. And I wouldn't even call it a misunderstanding. It's like learning another language sometimes.
It
And
is, yeah.
I've been at the University of Washington for a long time. Man alive, a long time. But I have worked in other jobs. And one thing that I have learned is that language changes in different organizations.
Yeah.
And as records manager, you need to be able to adopt your organization's language. And so it's less a misunderstanding and more learning a new language, literally a foreign language, and saying, okay, if this is what we call it here, works for me, I will make a note, and that's how we'll move forward. As long as we're on the same page and understand each other, that's all that counts.
Yeah, every organization is an evolution of maybe many years in most cases. So yeah, you've got to go with that stream that's already flowing.
Exactly so.
Yeah, good. So that gives us some good background. Let's talk about some specific things here. Like um, my general understanding of things over the years has been that like a retention schedule, if we talk about that phrase or that term, is a collection of record series.
Yes.
Um, and we'll have some formal definitions here in just a moment. But in that process, though, schedules can be grouped by business function or by department. But in my experience, I've usually found that when you talk about record series, you're typically talking about department-specific record series. But maybe that's just my particular way that I've seen it or the way that I've approached it. Um, is that similar to what you've seen, or is it just kind of my own take on it?
You know, I think this goes back to the beginning of our conversation and your first question. Back in the day when things were very, very paper-based, and 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 when when salaries were low and staff was cheap, and we actually had enough people to do the work, um, we were able to again go back to those one-to-one situations, and create department-specific retentions. But over time and evolution, and also trying to do more with less, as we say here. I mean, certainly at the University of Washington here, we kind of follow the National Archives model, where we have what we call a general records retention schedule, and then we have separate concept of departmental retention schedules. So as we say in our training, we create two types of retention schedules for the university community. And one is the general schedule, and the general schedule lists records that most folks have in common. So it goes across departments. And so if you take the example of a personnel file, as we say, if you've seen one personnel file, no matter how interesting the employee may be, you've seen every personnel file, and we have a retention standard in our organization, a retention period that applies to all personnel files, regardless what department someone is in.
Makes
And
sense.
and there are going to be some examples later on, and so I have an example of that. But by the same token, we have, in my organization that I'm working in now, we have some departments who have very specific functions that no one else has. And because of those functions, they create very specific type of records. And so one example that we'll show you of a departmental retention schedule that we do for these people whose records would not be appropriate to include on a general schedule is our environmental health and safety, radiation safety office, because there's not many departments at the university who are responsible for running a nuclear reactor. And so, yes, it's decommissioned.
Pretty niche there, yeah.
It's all good. It's decommissioned now, but for a while we had a nuclear reactor, and radiation safety was in charge of it and created a lot of records around it. And so we call it a unique departmental schedule for those records.
Right, and that kind of falls in line with the whole concept of the staff versus line, production line, if you will. So any organization sort of divides on those administrative versus sort of production uh, uh, demarcations, I guess is the best word. And so yeah, whenever there's engineering involved or manufacturing, things like that, those are very specific types of schedules that typically apply to those types of records.
Right,
So
but I think, so State of Washington, University of Washington is a state agency, State of Washington, and we have colleagues who work in the state auditor's office.
Mm-hmm.
And the state auditor's office does one thing: they audit other state agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And so the state auditor's office only has a general schedule in Washington state. They don't
Sure.
have departmental schedules because they don't have departments with unique functions. And
Yeah.
so when you guys who are attending this session, when you think of your organization, how flatlined are you? Or do you kind of go like this and you have to hit those high and lows as well as that flatline point?
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's, since you've been mentioning the word functions, let's talk about functional schedules. Um, in terms of just kind of what that means, how you would describe that, and just kind of see if we can come up with a general description of that.
So for me, when I engage with an office, when I engage with a customer about records management, I play 20 questions with them. I do some research, but I also play 20 questions with them. And in my mind, I'm thinking, who are you? What are these records? Why are they created? And how are they used? And really, that boils down to what is the function of this
Right.
information, regardless of physical form or characteristics, as we say in Washington State, that you're creating or receiving or using or maintaining. And that's the function.
And
And
regardless of department that they belong to.
regardless of department, regardless of anything else, what is it? Why is it created and how is it used? That's the function. And that gives you lots of information. It's the jumping off point for figuring out what the retention period is and how to write it up and so on and so forth. So that being said, back in the day, 30, 40 years ago, which unfortunately I could talk about personally, retention schedules were organized. Sometimes you would see a retention schedule where record series would be listed in alphabetical order,
Hmm.
or record series on a retention schedule were listed by division and then in alphabetical order. Or by department and in alphabetical order within each department. And that got kind of unwieldy, and you ended up having a lot of duplication because every department, for example, has personnel records.
Sure.
And so one concept that grew over the last 40 years or so is the concept of functional schedules, where rather than listing series in alphabetical order or by division, you would say, what are the function of these records? And you would have subheadings on your general schedule of function. And then the records would be listed alphabetically within that functional category.
It almost sounds like an evolution of that same concept you mentioned earlier about having the super series, because
Exactly.
that super series where you had to broaden out from one to one to one to many, and that's really part of a broader category of information as well versus those specific departments. So it seems like just a natural flow from that in many respects.
I think it is. And I think the driver behind it, as we've said, and we keep saying, so sorry, I tend to repeat myself a lot, is on one hand, we keep, people are resistant to records management. They just want to keep their stuff. Either they want to get rid of it as soon as it's created, or my favorite line is, never ask someone, how long do you want to keep these records? Because they say forever. And then you push them and you determine that forever means until they retire.
Yeah.
So you're kind of sitting there, people are resistant to this. They don't want to do it. They don't want to take the time to do it. So one question is, how can we make interpreting this information as intuitive to them as possible? So you play with the organization of the retention schedule, functional schedules. And the other thing is, how could we make it easier for us as records managers to wrap our own head around it, as again, we're doing more with less.
Right. And this next idea, we kind of referenced it a little bit when we talked about descriptions of records, but I think it plays into the topic of functional schedules, because as you broaden out the categories and the topics, it seems like you do have to get more specific with the examples so that people understand that this includes their stuff. So
Yeah.
like what you described earlier. Would that be true?
Yeah, and that goes back to the beginning of this conversation about semantics.
Right.
It's, but again, you don't want to get so granular that if the document name changes, you have to update the record series and then the schedule.
Hmm.
And so well, it's all about balance, isn't it? It's not black or white, it's living in the gray.
Yeah, and I've seen many types of schedules where the examples are just part of the description, and I've
Mhm.
seen others where they take those examples and make them subseries. So they almost go back to the one-to-one record series because,
Exactly. It's kind of, and that's kind of answering a couple of, so we try to be clever. We try to be clever and we try to be creative, period. But it's kind of when you start getting into the whole subseries thing, I think that is, again, as a preview of what we'll be talking about, we did receive some questions in advance of this session. And one of the questions was about privacy, PII, and in my world, because we have a medical center and multiple hospitals, PHI. So when you're thinking about that, you're starting to move a little bit into the world of a bucket
yes,
schedule. And when so you've got a functional schedule and you're listing and you're choosing, because you don't have to list the different type of documents under there. But they all have the same retention period.
right.
So that's really easy. But when you start doing the whole sub-series thing, which comes from the archives background, the term sub-series, you may be listing things that have different retention periods
Mm,
under the same umbrella.
right. And kind of just lumping the retention together, normalizing it.
Right,
Yeah. That,
exactly.
in fact, let me skip this one item here and I'll come back to it, but that's kind of where we get into the big bucket idea. And I always wonder, like, how is a big bucket schedule different than a functional schedule? Do you have any
Well,
input on that?
I have to say, quite honestly, I have always struggled greatly with big bucket schedules. It's like a bridge too far for me, considering where I started. So I'm looking at my notes now because I did a little bit of research to make sure that I'd be in the right place with this. And so when you look it up, and you'll talk about this in the definitions, Warren, but a big bucket schedule corresponds to major activities or business processes or business functions or work processes, but it can include individual examples. And so, you know, so man, I've seen, if you were really doing a big bucket schedule, let's go back and use the example that I gave a little bit earlier of the state auditor's office. They would have a retention schedule that has one item on it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And everything that they do and the different types of audits they do would be on that schedule. And then, and then they would have two series. And then the second series would be administrative records, which is how they run their individual offices. And where that's very efficient. Man, it makes me, I struggle. I have to admit, I struggle greatly. Although I, again, going back to what I was saying before, also, I look at these concepts as these things as part of a toolkit that I could pull out and use what I want, where I want to use it, because I'm making the decisions, right? I can do anything I want. And so in our general schedule, in our general records retention schedule for the university, we have some record series displayed as a big bucket concept. And then
Mhm.
we have other record series that are very specific one-to-one type things. So
What
it's
I've
interesting.
noticed, what I've noticed in that evolution is that um, the computerization of the retention schedule has sort of lent itself to creating these big buckets. So, for example, I've seen organizations that say, well, we want to have just, a dozen buckets,
Mhm.
you know, down from the, 3,000 or so from before. But part of that is because they can say, well, here are all these different records that have the same retention period. That's going to be one bucket. And then what that means is that within the description of that, they have to have enough examples so that you can do a search to say, okay, well, which bucket does that belong to? And that
We
was just something that wasn't as feasible without the ability to do keyword searches on the schedule.
exactly. So we actually played with that, oh, a good number of years ago. I went through I did an exercise, and I just thinking about it gives me a headache. I went through our general schedule and I said, how many different retention periods do we actually have on this thing? And roughly speaking, we have maybe on our general schedule, maybe 300 different record series on it.
Yeah.
And I went through and discovered that we had 7 retention periods.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, okay, maybe that would make it easier for people, because the whole
Sure.
point is what will make it easier for our customers to actually implement this stuff and be in compliance. And I played with that a lot. And the problem that I ran into, and this also may be more of a Washington state thing, but I think a lot of folks do this. When we look at, and this is going off on a bit of a tangent, but I do that all the time. When we look at a retention period for us has 2 pieces. One piece is the number of years you're counting, but the
Mm-hmm.
other piece has the trigger when you
Sure.
start counting down. And so in terms of number of years that we're counting, we had 7 choices. Very, very easy, 7 buckets. But then when we looked at what the state of Washington calls a cutoff, what we tend at the University of Washington to call a records retention trigger date, we discovered those were really nuanced,
Right.
because we have student records, we have financial records. So already you're getting into end of academic year as opposed to end of fiscal year, and so when we started nuancing those cutoffs as well as the actual retention period, it started to get really complicated, and we gave up on the idea of big buckets here.
Yeah, and some people try to reduce that down to like 3 retention periods, but that gets really difficult when you're dealing with those such a variable type of trigger like you mentioned. That makes it really difficult.
And I think, again, it goes back to, no offense, but it goes back to how complicated the organization you're working for is. If
Yeah.
you're the state auditor's office, you do one thing, we're done. But when you work in an organization that has multiple regulatory requirements that may vary greatly, or very different types of records with different retention requirements around it, it starts to get a little bit complicated to do that.
Definitely. Well, real briefly, I just want to touch on this idea of file plans and taxonomies as well, because sometimes that sneaks in there as well. And I've always, well, at least not always, but lately I've begun to think about file plans and taxonomies as being kind of legacy terms, but would you say that they're still relevant, or how do they play into that?
That is such an interesting question. It's all about mapping, isn't it? It's all about being able to map the retention schedule to what you actually have in the office by way of the file plan. And so I've always said that file plans and retention schedules are 2 different things, but the retention schedules influence the way you're going to write your file plan. And taxonomies, on the other hand, very library term taxonomies. I think that, to me, and this is, personal opinion, no basis in reality, but I think, to me, what I've seen happen with taxonomies is they've become indexing terms and metadata tags
Hmm.
and keyword search terms. So we had a project in our office some years ago. We were very fortunate to hire an excellent, excellent person who was in a records management program and needed an internship. And she did this phenomenal taxonomy for us for our general schedule. And so now we're able to do keyword searches that you were talking about before, Warren, off our general schedule, where people can go in and enter a word, and then any record series that would have that word associated with it comes up, and then they can figure out which one they can use.
That's great. Yeah, and I usually associate file plans with basically how you organize your physical files typically. So that can still have a relevance in the digital age, but I don't think as much.
I think, it depends on where your records reside in the space that you're working in. And it depends on whether you're dealing with, I lost it. I lost the terminology. Holy cats. I'm sorry, it's Thursday. Structured or unstructured data.
Right.
In a digital environment, if your records reside in a space that's structured data, like a database, or even SharePoint to a degree, because that has a structure that you have to set up, and then your records have to fit into that structure, you don't have to worry as much about a file plan. But we still have hordes and hordes and hordes of people here at the university who have unstructured data. They have shared directories. The vortex of chaos is what a shared directory is. And it's literally like a filing cabinet, but people are being intuitive for that very moment in the way they're labeling a document. And they're not even putting the document in a folder. I've seen filing cabinets where you open the drawer and there's just like a pile of paper, but most times you open a drawer and at least people are putting it in a folder, and in a shared directory, they're not even doing that. So having a file plan for a shared directory is crucial, absolutely crucial. But
that's a really good point.
As we move into, document management systems, and we use cloud providers for our information, there may be a file plan with that vendor is providing for you. It's not as important, but it depends on where you're working.
The vortex of chaos, I like that.
It's the nicest thing I could say about it.
One last piece on this one here. I don't think we have to spend a lot of time, but just sometimes I've seen schedules defined as policies, but I think there's a key difference there where the policy is generally describing kind of the overarching I guess directive of the purpose of the retention schedule versus the specific characteristics. Would that be an accurate way to describe that?
I would agree 100%. Although I have to say we are in a place right now that's really fascinating, and I'm not sure. I want to leverage it, but I'm not sure what I want to do with it. I mean, it's literally just come up recently. I agree. The policy is follow your retention schedule, and then the schedule tells you how to implement the policy. So I agree 100%. But we are, I mentioned to you earlier before this started, sorry, that was hysterical laughter, not a funny hysterical. We're doing this massive move onto a new finance system for the university. And so we're working even more closely than we normally do with IT people. And as we're working with our finance transformation team, as they're known, these consultants from outside the university who are helping us in this journey are calling the retention schedules policies. And so they're even calling the separate record series retention policies. And on one hand, my gut reaction is no, 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 it's not a policy. But then I sit there and I think, if a policy, and they came up with this on their own, if calling it a policy gives it extra credibility, and that credibility may help people implement it or understand the importance of implementing it. But then you come up against the whole, here at the university, we have a very specific definition of what a university policy is, as opposed to what a university procedure is. And this is definitely blowing that out of the water. And so part of me is sitting there saying, can I do something with this? I really shouldn't. So again, so I'm adding, so very within the last month, literally, I'm adding that term policy to my toolkit. and I'm thinking, okay, I'm not comfortable with it right now, but maybe that's something that I'm going to come back to a little bit later. But I agree 100% with you. Normally, I would never call a retention schedule. It's the policy to follow the schedule. The schedule itself isn't the policy.
So more bemuddlement.
Yeah, yeah, but whatever works, right?
Right. All right, I want to do another quick poll here, and this is going to be about kind of to what degree you let departments do their own thing, so to speak. So let me go ahead and launch that and see what we get back on that one. Just give that a few moments here for people to fill that in. This will be interesting because I always kind of wonder how strictly people manage their schedules, their policies, if you will. So yeah, it looks quite interesting already. Got a
I'm looking forward to the
majority.
results on this.
Yeah, majority are in. I'm going to give just a few more seconds here. I think that's about good. So let me cut it off right there. Okay, so here are the results. So the majority, but a slim majority, don't allow any deviation. Actually expected that to be higher in many respects, but then a good portion allow modification of descriptions and some retention periods, and then some even allow full latitude. So really
Wow.
interesting. Is that different than what you would have expected, Barb?
Well, it's each organization's culture, and it's also how much authority the records management program has. I
Yeah,
mean, the way I would answer this for myself is my gut reaction is don't touch the schedule. We don't allow any deviation. But that being said, that's not 100% correct because let's say we're open to deviation. Let's use a different term than deviation. We're open to revision. How's that?
yeah,
And so if someone wants to change, modify titles or descriptions, or even if they're very uncomfortable or have a hard time implementing the retention period, they come to us and then we'll work with them in partnership to try to find something that works better for them. And then I approve it, period.
got it.
So they can't just huddle off on their own and do their thing. They have to go through us. And then I can be flexible sometimes.
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 All right, I want to switch gears here and just kind of run through a few formal definitions. So we've just kind of collected a few different terms, and I want to show you what we've got in terms of different organizations such as ARMA. So this is how ARMA describes their record series, basically a group of related records that are filed or used together as a unit and evaluated as a unit for retention purposes. And they make an example of a personnel file, an application, reference letter, etc. Society of American Archivists, they say it's kind of similar there, a group of similar records that are arranged according to a filing system and that are related as the result of being created, received, or used in the same activity.
That's the one I grew up on.
Okay, and then finally NARA, a group of records arranged according to a filing system or kept together because they relate to a particular subject or function. Now we're kind of getting into that functional type.
Right.
Or if they result from the same activity, document, a specific type of transaction, exist in the same media format, or have some other type of relationship. So that seems to be similar to what we've talked about here in terms of our take on things. I don't think that deviates too far from that.
And I think though, we started with ARMA and we went down, and now we have to come back full circle because in records management world, a key part that SAA and NARA are not mentioning is one retention period for one record series.
Yeah, that's a good
Different
point.
record series on a schedule could have different retention periods, one retention period for one record series.
Yeah, it's interesting that none of these mention the retention period itself.
Just
Well, sort of.
for retention purposes. So
Yeah,
you infer that, but yeah, that's an important point.
yeah, that's interesting. And then similarly, retention schedule. So a comprehensive list of record series titles. So basically that gets to that idea of it being a collection of record series.
Mhm.
And there they do talk about the length of or the length of time it's to be maintained. And SAA, document that identifies and describes an organization's records, usually at the series level. They say usually, so they recognize it's not always in that case. And then NARA, a printed agency manual or directive containing the records descriptions and dispositions instructions used or approved by NARA. Yeah.
That's so Nora-centric. It's fabulous.
One thing that I find interesting as far as our take on this is that I have in some cases found that the retention schedule refers to the entire document or entity, one organization's full collection of retention stuff, if I'll call it that. But in some cases, a retention schedule can be one functional group or one category. So it depends too. Even if you take these definitions, you could still kind of, I don't know, in some ways look at it either way.
I think again, you put it in your toolkit, and
Yeah.
depending on your circumstances, which will change depending on where you work, you pull out whatever fits that your situation, your level of authority, the culture you're working within, whatever works it's very helpful.
And I'll just run through a couple more here pretty quickly. So classification system, so system in which related materials filed under a major subject and its subheadings. That gets a little bit murky as well. Organization of materials into categories according to one scheme that identifies, distinguishes, and relates the categories. And Nora didn't have a take on classification. So that's sort of a term that I think can be used when you're, I don't know, trying to not reference schedules or series, and you're just saying, well, it's just they're sort of classified together.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's a term that, I don't know, I used to use it a lot when I first started 40 years ago, and I don't really think of it that much anymore. It actually, in some ways, you could call a functional category a classification.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
that's a more modern interpretation of it these days.
Just a little bit more generic.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of along with that, functional
There you go.
classification. So that's basically the same kind of thing, but you're organizing it on the basis of the function or activity.
Exactly so.
Pretty similar there,
Mm-hmm.
and also pretty similar. So those are all fairly similar. So I found it interesting that in the term of big bucket, ARMA didn't have a definition, at least not that I found in their glossary. SAA called it the appraisal criteria related to groups of information, usually based on function. So again, it sort of aligns with that functional approach.
And I do have to say, when I was doing the research on big buckets, because it's been a while for me, and again, I was never comfortable with it, I found some great ARMA articles written on big bucket series. So if you Google big bucket retention schedules, you'll find some ARMA articles. That ARMA publications are the best. They're really, really helpful.
That's good. Yeah, that's good to know. And I think it's interesting here that this sort of does imply in the NARA definition that it is it's zooming out even further than say the functional or kind of super series classifications that we talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it takes kind of like a division in an organization, and everything that division does is one series.
Right. It's just zooming out further. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little too aggregated for my taste, frankly.
This one is just saw that, sometimes we use record codes, and so I wanted to see if there's anything in there. And so um, I thought that the SAA was a better definition as far as like a sequence of characters and digits that reference the items versus just file designations. That seemed a little ambiguous to me on the ARMA side.
Yeah, I've seen this used. Department of Defense uses it. The military
Mm.
uses it a lot, and I've come across it at the university here for former military who are working here. You have to. It was helpful again in a paper environment because when you've got a filing cabinet, you've got no indexing for it. And so if you can code your filing system, it gives you some type of additional way to access the material. But I
Yeah,
think these days in a digital environment, metadata tags and even basic indexing are kind of taking the place of this.
I would agree. Yeah, and it's just a good way to have a shorthand reference to the items.
Mhm.
In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past the taxonomy, and I think I've got file plan as well. They'll be
Mhm.
here for people to reference when we send this out later. But this kind of just underscores what we had talked about before as far as the file plan is concerned. I did want to get into the examples that we have, just so people can see a couple of different examples in terms of the way that we can do it in our software, and you have it in your schedule as well, Barbara. So um, in here, just one quick example of what we can do, like in our versatile retention software, where in this case, I've got basically a business hierarchy here. These are sort of essentially business functions. So it's more of a functional sort of bucketed approach. Maybe it's sort of a hybrid approach, but we do call each individual item a schedule title within the overall retention schedule. So these are just sort of broad categories, each with a retention period, each with their citations referenced. But also in our example, we can expand each one of those. Like if I expand the ACF 05, that can have sub-series as well. So now we're kind of getting back into that idea of having either each example listed or going back to that sort of individual record series approach where it's more one-to-one, as you mentioned. So again, this kind of lends itself to a lot of different ways to structure it just because it's pretty flexible depending on how you want to do that, because these could be departments instead of business functions, just depending on how you want to do that. And then in your example, Barb, maybe you can kind of explain what this part of it refers to.
Sure. So this is, as you can see, this is off our website and talks about our university general records retention schedule. And if you look to your right, the top gray box, we have over time changed the way we organize the record series on our general schedule. And now it's, for us, very much, it's a functional schedule. So student records are separate from financial records, which are not personnel records, which are not, because we have so many labs where research is conducted, which is separate from the concept of environmental health and safety and facilities. And so when people go looking for a record series here, they can choose the section of the schedule that best meets the function. And then the records are listed in alphabetical order, or we also have a keyword search, and you could search across the entire general schedule. And that was our taxonomy project.
Perfect. Okay. And then this is getting into some of the more detailed listings.
Right. So this is off our financial records. And this is kind of, I chose these because this is an example that we still have one-to-ones. So we have something simple like a delegation of authority. It's a 6-year record. 6 years is a magic number in Washington State. Many of our retention periods are 6-year records. But when you compare it to the endowment fund records, look at the difference in the records retention trigger date.
Hmm,
And
right.
so that's why we didn't say financial records, boom, 6-year record, because that nuance of that trigger, of that cutoff, makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, we hope that the endowment fund records that are in the treasurer's office, we hope that we'll have them forever. They're essentially permanent records, but we don't know that. And so we have to quantify it. And just for quickie, one thing that we do on our schedules is we have an official copy concept and another copy concept, because we don't want everyone keeping the same records for the same amount of time. That's too much
That's a
volume.
good point. Yeah.
This is an example, obviously, off this section of our general schedule. And this is, to me, this is what I would call a bucket series.
Right.
So it's not a bucket retention schedule, but we dipped into our toolkit and we created a bucket series, because let's face it, there's very little that cash register tapes have in common with packing slips.
Right.
But we made a list of all of the financial records that have the same retention period, number of years, and cutoff. And we said, hey, doesn't matter what it is, it all is a financial record, same function. We're going to throw it into one bucket, and then you guys dip into the bucket. And then
And
we
it's all
just
the same retention too.
and it's all the same retention, which is a really important point. And you guys can just go in and it's one-stop shopping. And it
Good
also
example of
makes it
those.
easy for us as well.
Yeah, it's a good example of those unique descriptions within the bucket.
So.
I know that we're just a little bit over time. We'll just have a couple more examples here. This is more your departmental schedule, correct?
This is for my departmental schedule. So this is environmental health and safety, radiation safety that I mentioned. You could note the building decommissioning, a wonderful retention period on that one. That was our, we have other buildings that have a lot of radioactive material being used in research, but the main, that was a big one for our decommissioning of the nuclear reactor.
Yeah,
but,
not everybody has a nuclear reactor they have to worry about.
Right, and so this does not belong on a general schedule, because this is the only office, and it would only make the general schedule larger and more unwieldy and confuse the people who do use it. And so this is why we do the two types of schedules. But I will also say, I know, government, I got to be careful who I give a plug for. The reason I know you so long, Warren, is because we've been using Versatile this long. And we do our general schedule and our department schedules. We use Versatile Enterprise, and we're able to get this format of this horrifically bad report that the state of Washington required from us at one point. We're able to get this report off Versatile, so it makes life very easy for us.
Excellent. Well, let's just do one last poll to wrap things up here. Real quick question. I've already gone past that. Let me just do this one. That is just based on this, will you change any of your terminology or the way that you do things? And so we'll see what people say on that one. And I appreciate everyone hanging in there to the end, even though we're a couple minutes over. And I think for Q&A, we will take the Q&A questions offline and respond to those. Instead of verbally, we'll respond to them afterward in written form. And so that way we can let people go here and get back to their daily work. All right, so I think that we've got the majority of those, so we'll close that poll out. So it looks like a few, actually more than I expected, might actually change the way that they talk about things. Some won't, and a lot of them are just not sure.
Well, something to think about.
Yes, exactly. All right. So just one last thing here. Do stay tuned for the next webinar in this series. We will let you know in our newsletter and some other advertising as far as when that takes place. And if you have any need to contact us, you can learn more about us at our website and using our email address there or our phone number. And we will be making this recording available. So if you have other things you want to reference on that, you'll have that available. And Jerry, any other last minute things that we want to share with the group?
Yeah, I think you covered about everything. Yeah, we did get some good questions that came in, so we'll make sure to answer those in a follow-up. So thank you, everyone, for getting those in.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Barb.
Pleasure.